In the late 1800s, thousands of Swedes packed up everything they knew and sailed across the Atlantic, chasing a better life in Minnesota. But survival on the cold prairie wasn't guaranteed, and their secret weapon was food. From hearty potato sausage simmering on the stove to pickled herring pulled out at Christmas, every meal told a story of grit, faith, and survival. These weren't just recipes, they were memories from the old country, transformed to fit a new and unforgiving land. And here's the hidden truth. Many of these dishes are still alive today, tucked into church basements, family gatherings, and holiday feasts across Minnesota. So stick with me, because the 25 meals served by Swedish immigrants in the late 1800s will take you on a journey through struggle, tradition, and the surprising flavors that shaped the Midwest. 1. Swedish meatballs with cream sauce and lingonberry jam. Few dishes carry the Swedish immigrant story like meatballs in cream sauce, brightened with a spoonful of lingonberry jam. In the late 1800s, Minnesota families didn't eat these as an everyday luxury. They were a careful celebration. Meat was scarce, so thrifty hands mixed beef or pork with breadcrumbs and eggs to stretch every ounce. A cast-iron pan sizzled with butter and onions, filling cabins with warmth against the winter cold. And then came the magic. A silky cream sauce poured over the browned meatballs with a jar of tart lingonberries pulled from the pantry. That sweet-sour bite wasn't just flavor, it was memory. It brought Sweden's forests into a Minnesota farmhouse, giving weary settlers a taste of home. These meals reminded families that even in hardship, food could be joy. And here's the surprise. Today, you can make a whole pot for under $12, feeding 4 people cheaper than drive-through burgers. But meatballs were tame compared to the next dish, one so controversial it still splits Minnesota families at Christmas. 2. Lutefisk with butter and boiled potatoes. Now, here's the dish that made neighbors whisper. Lutefisk. For Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, this wasn't just food, it was identity. Cod shipped from Norway, dried hard as wood, then soaked in lye until it turned translucent and jelly-like. Sounds strange? It was. But when boiled, smothered with melted butter, and served with potatoes, it became the taste of Christmas. Imagine a log cabin in December. Snow pressed against the windows, candles glowed, and on the table sat a steaming platter of lutefisk. Children wrinkled their noses, adults smiled through tradition, and everyone knew it wasn't Christmas without it. For settlers, this dish was proof they hadn't lost their roots, even on the far prairie. Was it loved? Was it hated? Honestly, both. Even today, Minnesota church basements argue over whether lutefisk is delicacy or punishment. But back then, it was sacred, a way of saying, we're still Swedish. And after fish that sparked debates came another staple, one salty, vinegary, and shared at nearly every immigrant gathering, the humble pickled herring platter. 3. Pickled herring platter with rye bread and onions. If there was one dish that never missed a gathering, it was the pickled herring platter. For Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, herring wasn't just a food, it was tradition packed into a jar. Salted, brined, and sometimes laced with vinegar, onions, and spices, this preserved fish could survive long winters when fresh catch was scarce. Picture a farmhouse table in the 1880s, a platter of herring glistening, rye bread sliced thick, onions piled sharp on top. The first bite? Salty, tangy, a punch of the sea in the middle of the prairie. It reminded families of coastal Sweden, where herring was cheap and abundant. Out here, it was a lifeline, protein that kept through the cold months. But it wasn't only survival. Sharing herring was social. Weddings, baptisms, Christmas feasts, no table was complete without it. And here's the kicker. Today, jars of pickled herring still sit on Minnesota grocery shelves, proof that immigrant flavors never really fade. And if herring was the taste of memory, the next dish brought the lakes of Minnesota straight into the skillet. Smoked lake trout cakes with dill sauce. 4. Smoked lake trout cakes with dill sauce. Minnesota's lakes weren't just beautiful, they were the pantry of Swedish immigrants. Trout, Whitefish and pike filled nets, and one clever way to stretch the catch was smoking it, then turning the meat into cakes. Mixed with breadcrumbs, potatoes, and onions, these golden patties fried up crisp, ready for a dollop of dill sauce. Imagine a summer afternoon by the lake. A father rows in with his catch, the family gathers to gut and smoke the fish, and by evening the cabin smells of wood smoke and frying butter. The cakes were hearty enough to fill bellies after long days in the fields, but light enough to remind settlers of coastal meals back in Sweden. The dill sauce tied it all together, bright, herby, and fresh, cutting through the richness. Served with boiled potatoes, it was simple food elevated by ingenuity. And here's the thing, smoked trout cakes weren't just survival, they were pride, proof that Minnesota's lakes could provide. But fish wasn't the only thing transformed. The next dish turned beef into something surprisingly elegant, biff à la Lindström. 5. Biff à la Lindström. Not every Swedish dish on the Minnesota prairie was plain survival. Some meals carried a touch of elegance, and biff à la Lindström was one of them. Imagine beef patties blended with chopped beets, onions, potatoes, and a briny bite of capers. Pan-fried until crisp outside and tender inside, they were served with boiled potatoes and maybe a drizzle of gravy. For immigrant families, this dish felt special. Beets were easy to grow in Minnesota soil, and they added color and sweetness when meat was scarce. Capers were harder to come by, sometimes swapped with pickles, but they gave a sharpness that made the patties unforgettable. At the table, the flavors were a surprise. Hearty beef mixed with the earthiness of beets and the tang of vinegar. It was old-world creativity surviving in a new-world kitchen. And here's the kicker. What started as immigrant ingenuity is still served in Minnesota cafes today. But when the meat ran out, settlers had another trick up their sleeve, a humble hash called pyttipanna. 6. Pyttipanna. When scraps were all you had, pyttipanna turned nothing into something. Swedish immigrants in Minnesota knew waste wasn't an option, so they diced up yesterday's potatoes, onions, and bits of leftover meat, then fried it all together in a cast-iron pan. The result? A sizzling hash that filled the cabin with the smell of browned butter and roasted potatoes. Picture a chilly morning on the prairie, farmers rising before dawn, needing fuel for a long day in the fields. A skillet hit the stove, onions caramelized, and soon the family gathered for plates of golden hash, topped, if lucky, with a fried egg. It wasn't fancy, but it was hearty, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. This dish told a story of thrift and grit. Every scrap had value, every bite mattered. And here's the twist. Pyttipanna is still loved in Sweden today, served in diners and kitchens just like it was 140 years ago. But while hash kept bellies full, the next dish brought families together with something far more indulgent, Swedish-style potato sausage. 7. Swedish-style potato sausage with sauerkraut and mustard. Few smells could draw a family to the table faster than potato sausage sizzling in a pan. For Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, this sausage, potatiskorv, was the centerpiece of holidays and Sunday suppers. Made by grinding pork and beef with grated potatoes, onions, and seasoning, it was stuffed into casings and simmered or fried until tender. Why potatoes? Because they stretched the meat. In the late 1800s, families couldn't afford to waste a single pound of pork, and potatoes grew abundantly in Minnesota soil. The result was a sausage that was filling, flavorful, and thrifty all at once. Served with tangy sauerkraut and a spoonful of mustard, it tasted both hearty and celebratory. Picture Christmas Eve. Snow swirling outside, candles flickering, and a long table crowded with family. Potato sausage sat proudly beside bread, beer, and butter. It wasn't just food, it was tradition carried across the ocean. And here's the best part. You can still find potatiskorv in Minnesota meat markets today, proof that some flavors never die. But sausages weren't the only way to warm a cold night. The next dish was pure comfort in a bowl, blueberry soup with sweet cream and sugar. 8. Blueberry soup with sweet cream and sugar. Not every meal was meat and potatoes. Sometimes sweetness stole the spotlight. Blueberry soup, known as blåbärssoppa, was a favorite among Swedish immigrants in Minnesota. Made by simmering foraged berries with sugar until they burst into a purple broth, it was served warm in winter or chilled in summer, always with a swirl of sweet cream. Imagine children returning from berry picking with stained fingers and baskets brimming. Mothers boiled the berries down, filling cabins with a fragrant, fruity steam. A drizzle of cream softened the tartness, turning a humble harvest into comfort food. For settlers, this dish was more than dessert. It was medicine. Blueberries were prized for keeping bellies strong and spirits high during long, harsh winters. It was cheap, nourishing, and felt like a luxury when paired with thick rye bread. Even today in Minnesota, blueberry soup lingers at church suppers and midsummer festivals. But if soup was the sweet side of survival, the next dish brought sturdier fare: fish pie packed with whitefish and root vegetables. 9. Fish pie of whitefish and root vegetables. On the Minnesota frontier, lakes were generous, but winters were long. That's where fish pie came in. Swedish immigrants turned fresh-caught whitefish into a hearty casserole layered with root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and potatoes. Baked in a deep dish, it came out golden on top, steaming with the smell of dill and butter. Picture a winter evening in 1887. Snow piled high, the family huddled close, and from the oven came this humble pie. The whitefish gave protein, the roots stretched the meal, and together it became comfort in the cold. Nothing fancy, just a filling dish that could feed many mouths on little money. For settlers, fish pie wasn't just food, it was security. Each bite was a reminder that the lakes and soil could keep them alive, no matter how harsh the season. And while fish pie filled the belly, the next dish was pure elegance. Gravlax, salmon cured with dill and mustard, paired with tender new potatoes. 10. Gravlax with mustard dill sauce and boiled new potatoes. When Swedish immigrants in Minnesota wanted a taste of refinement, they made gravlax. Back in Sweden, fishermen buried salmon in salt, sugar, and dill to preserve it. In Minnesota, settlers adapted the method with lake trout or salmon shipped upriver. After a few days of curing, the fish turned silky, salty sweet, and fragrant with dill. Picture a summer gathering. A wooden table set outside, fresh dill snipped from the garden, and thin slices of gravlax laid neatly beside boiled new potatoes. A mustard dill sauce tied it all together, sharp, creamy, and bright. For families used to heavy stews, this dish felt festive and almost luxurious. It wasn't everyday fare, fresh fish was too precious, but when served, it reminded settlers of celebrations back home. And even in a landlocked state, gravlax became a bridge between old and new. But not every dish was elegant. Some were simple comforts, like a soft flatbread that became the heart of holiday breakfasts, lefse wraps with butter and sugar. 11. Lefse wraps with butter and sugar. Few foods stirred holiday joy like lefse. This soft flatbread, made from mashed potatoes, flour, and cream, was rolled paper-thin and cooked on a griddle until speckled with golden spots. For Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, lefse wasn't just bread, it was tradition. Imagine Christmas morning in a log cabin, snow outside, fire crackling, and a mother standing over the griddle, flipping delicate rounds of lefse. Children waited eagerly, butter dish and sugar bowl at the ready. Rolled up warm, the sweet buttery wrap melted in their mouths, a rare treat during lean years. Lefse was more than food. It was memory. It carried the flavors of Sweden while adapting to the abundance of Minnesota potatoes. Families passed down rolling pins and lefse sticks as treasured heirlooms, proof that the ritual mattered as much as the taste. And while lefse sweetened holidays, another dish brightened ordinary mornings: thin, buttery Swedish pancakes topped with berry compote. 12. Swedish pancakes with berry compote. If lefse was for holidays, Swedish pancakes were for everyday joy. Unlike thick American flapjacks, these were paper-thin, buttery, and cooked quickly on a hot skillet. Swedish immigrants in Minnesota poured the batter thin, flipped them with care, and stacked them high. Now picture a summer morning after berry picking. The children's baskets overflowed with blueberries, raspberries, or currants. Back in the cabin, those berries were simmered into a quick compote, spooned over warm pancakes, and dusted with sugar. The result? sweet, tart, and comforting all at once. For hard-working settlers, this dish was a reminder that life wasn't only toil. Pancakes stretched simple ingredients, eggs, milk, flour, into a meal that felt special. And the berry topping, fresh from the Minnesota woods, tied them directly to their new home. Even today, Swedish pancakes remain a staple at church breakfasts and family gatherings across the Midwest. But when sweetness gave way to hunger, settlers turned to a dish that was all about fuel: bean and pork stew with onions and rye mush. 13. Bean and pork stew with onions and rye mush. When the cold bit hard and money ran thin, Swedish immigrants in Minnesota leaned on bean and pork stew. Simple, hearty, and cheap, it became the backbone of many prairie suppers. White beans simmered slowly with salted pork and onions until the broth turned rich and filling. To stretch it further, rye mush, thick porridge made from coarse rye meal, was served on the side or ladled right into the bowl. Picture a January night. Wind howling outside, children wrapped in quilts, and a pot bubbling steadily on the stove. The aroma of onions and pork drifted through the cabin, promising warmth and strength for tomorrow's labor. It wasn't glamorous, but it stuck to the ribs and kept families going through the hardest months. This dish proved that survival didn't have to mean starvation. It meant making the most of humble ingredients. And when meat was more plentiful, the menu shifted to something wilder: venison steak with juniper berry sauce and cabbage. 14. Venison steak with juniper berry sauce and cabbage. When game was plentiful, venison took center stage. For Swedish immigrants in Minnesota, deer hunting wasn't just sport, it was survival. A venison steak, seared in butter, paired with braised cabbage and a sauce infused with crushed juniper berries, brought the deep forests straight to the dinner table. Picture autumn in the 1880s. A hunter returns at dusk, dragging a deer through the falling leaves. The family butchers the animal, every part destined for use: meat for steaks and roasts, hides for warmth, bones for broth. That night, a cast-iron pan sizzles with venison, the sharp, piney scent of juniper mingling with the sweetness of cabbage. It was rustic, yes, but also refined, an echo of flavors from home. For immigrants, venison meant abundance. It turned a hard season into a feast, proof that the wild land could provide. But when fresh meat wasn't at hand, settlers relied on simpler staples, like potato salad dressed with dill and eggs, perfect for summer gatherings. 15. Potato salad with hard-boiled egg and dill vinaigrette. Not every meal was heavy or cooked over hours. When summer arrived, Swedish immigrants in Minnesota turned to something bright and refreshing: potato salad. Boiled potatoes were diced and tossed with chopped hard-boiled eggs, fresh dill, and a tangy vinaigrette. Sometimes onions or pickles made their way in, depending on what the garden or pantry offered. Picture a Sunday picnic after church. Families spread blankets in the grass, children ran barefoot, and baskets opened to reveal cold potato salad alongside bread and smoked fish. It was light, portable, and perfect for feeding a crowd. The dill, snipped straight from backyard gardens, gave it that unmistakable Scandinavian flavor. For settlers, potato salad wasn't just side dish. It was proof that even simple ingredients could feel festive. Eggs from the coop, herbs from the soil, and potatoes from the field combined into something greater than the sum of its parts. And when summer gave way to winter, another comforting favorite appeared: rice pudding sprinkled with cinnamon and almonds. 16. Rice pudding with cinnamon and almonds. For Swedish immigrants, few desserts felt as comforting as rice pudding. It was simple. Rice simmered slowly in milk until creamy, sweetened with sugar, and finished with a dusting of cinnamon. But at Christmas, one extra touch made it special: a single almond hidden in the pot. Whoever found it was said to have luck for the coming year. Picture a frosty December night in Minnesota. The cabin glows with lamplight, children giggling as bowls of warm pudding are passed around. Steam curls up, carrying the scent of cinnamon through the room. As spoons clink, everyone waits to see who bites into the almond. It was more than dessert. It was tradition, joy, and a little magic in the middle of winter. For settlers, rice was an imported luxury, but worth the cost for holidays. It turned a hard prairie winter into a moment of sweetness and hope, and when rice ran short, families leaned on local grains, like hearty barley and mushroom stew. 17. Barley and mushroom stew with herbs. When rice or meat was scarce, barley and mushroom stew became a lifeline. Barley grew well in Minnesota soil, and mushrooms, whether foraged from damp woods or dried for storage, added depth and richness without costing a cent. Simmered together with onions, carrots, and a handful of herbs, the stew was hearty enough to carry a family through long days of work. Picture autumn in the 1880s. Children return from the forest with baskets of chanterelles or morels, proud of their find. In the cabin, a pot of barley bubbles gently, mushrooms tossed in to soften and flavor the broth. The scent is earthy, nutty, and comforting, filling the room as the wind rattles the shutters. For Swedish immigrants, this dish wasn't just about survival. It was about using the land wisely. Every foraged mushroom, every grain of barley stretched their larder further. And though humble, it tasted like home. But when the lakes provided, families upgraded supper with browned butter-baked fish and parsley potatoes. 18. Browned butter-baked fish and parsley potatoes. Minnesota's lakes were endless pantries, and Swedish immigrants knew how to make the most of them. One favorite dish was baked lakefish, often pike or perch, smothered in browned butter and served alongside boiled potatoes tossed with fresh parsley. Simple, yes, but it carried the taste of both old and new worlds. Picture a summer evening after a long day of fishing. The family gathers by the stove, a fresh catch laid out, cleaned, and seasoned. As the fish bakes, butter browns in a pan, releasing that nutty aroma that clings to every corner of the cabin. Potatoes, pulled straight from the garden, are boiled and brightened with parsley. When plated, the meal is golden, fragrant, and filling. For settlers, it was proof that Minnesota could provide abundance. No costly imports, no extravagance, just fish from the lake, potatoes from the soil, and butter from the churn. A complete feast born from the land itself, and when meat was scarce, another rustic favorite appeared. Swedish cottage pie with ground meat tucked under a crust of mashed potatoes. 19. Swedish rustic cottage pie. When meat had to stretch far, Swedish immigrants turned to rustic cottage pie. Ground beef or pork was browned with onions and carrots, then spread in a dish and topped with mashed potatoes, whipped smooth with butter and milk. Baked until the top crust turned golden, it came to the table bubbling and hearty. Picture a cold autumn night. Smoke curling from the chimney, children rubbing their hands warm by the stove, and the smell of savory meat filling the cabin. When the pie was pulled from the oven, its browned potato crust cracked open to reveal tender meat and vegetables underneath. Every spoonful was rich, filling, and nourishing. For families with little, cottage pie was survival dressed as comfort food. It stretched scraps into something that felt whole, proof that ingenuity mattered as much as ingredients. And when gardens overflowed with roots, another thrifty favorite came simmering. Root vegetable hot pot with pork lardons. 20. Root vegetable hot pot with pork lardons. When gardens overflowed, Swedish immigrants turned humble roots into a feast. Turnips, carrots, and potatoes were chopped, layered into a pot, and simmered slowly with a handful of pork lardons. The pork added just enough fat and salt to transform simple vegetables into something hearty and satisfying. Picture a Minnesota farmhouse in late October. Frost creeping over the fields, root cellars packed with vegetables, and a pot simmering gently on the stove. Steam carried the earthy scent of roots mingled with smoky pork, filling the kitchen with warmth. Each bowl was rustic but nourishing, fuel for the long, dark months ahead. For families who had little meat, this dish was proof that flavor didn't require extravagance. Roots from the soil, fat from the hog, and patience over the fire created a meal that stuck to the ribs. And after such plain suppers, settlers often craved sweetness, like a coffee cake spiced with cardamom and topped with almond streusel. 21. Coffee cake with cardamom and almond streusel. When Swedish immigrants gathered for fellowship, nothing sweetened the moment like coffee cake. Made with flour, butter, and sugar, it rose golden in the oven and filled the cabin with warmth. But what set it apart was the spice, cardamom, brought from the old country, mixed right into the dough. Topped with a crunchy almond streusel, every slice tasted like home. Picture a Sunday afternoon in Minnesota. After church, neighbors crowded into a farmhouse, mugs of strong coffee in hand. On the table sat the coffee cake, its spiced aroma cutting through the chatter. Slices were shared freely, crumbs scattered, children sneaking extra bites. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt rich, comfort from a faraway land baked into every bite. For settlers, coffee cake was more than dessert. It was community, memory, and celebration all at once. But not every meal was sweet. Some nights called for something bolder, like liver and onions with creamy gravy and parsley potatoes. 22. Liver and onions with creamed gravy and buttered parsley potatoes. Not every cut of meat was prized, but Swedish immigrants knew how to make the most of what they had. Liver, cheap and packed with iron, often became supper. Sliced thin, dredged in flour, and fried with onions until rich and caramelized, it was served with a creamy gravy and boiled potatoes tossed in butter and parsley. Picture a weekday evening in the 1880s. The day's work finished, lanterns lit, and a skillet sizzling on the stove. The sharp scent of onions mingled with the savory aroma of liver browning in butter. It wasn't a feast. It was practical nourishment, the kind that kept strength in weary bodies. For children, it might have been an acquired taste, but for hard-working parents, it was fuel disguised as comfort. Even in its simplicity, the parsley potatoes added a touch of freshness, softening the meal's edge. And when liver wasn't on the menu, another thrifty dish filled the pot: cabbage rolls stuffed with pork and rice. 23. Cabbage rolls stuffed with pork and rice. Few dishes stretched ingredients as cleverly as Swedish-style cabbage rolls. Big green leaves were softened in boiling water, then wrapped around a filling of ground pork, rice, onions, and spices. Nestled into a pot, the rolls simmered slowly in broth until tender, their flavors melding into hearty perfection. Picture a Minnesota kitchen in harvest season. Heads of cabbage stacked high, families working together to prepare meals that would last through winter. The rolls came out steaming, savory juices spooned over the top, potatoes often served alongside. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling and frugal. 1 pound of pork could feed a crowd when wrapped this way. For settlers, cabbage rolls tasted like home, yet fit perfectly into their new world. They showed how resourcefulness turned plain farm food into something special. And when fall fruit ripened, the sweetness of the land appeared on the table. An autumn apple and berry bake topped with oat crumble. 24. Autumn apple and berry bake with oat crumble. When orchards and berry patches overflowed, Swedish immigrants turned the harvest into comfort food. Apples were sliced thin, berries tossed in, and the mixture baked under a simple topping of oats, butter, and sugar. The result was warm, bubbling fruit crowned with a golden crumble, sweetness straight from the land. Picture a crisp October evening. Children carry baskets of apples from the orchard, their hands stained purple from picking late-season berries.